explain the reasons for changing attitudes towards immigration in the 1920s USA. During the 19th century, Europeans saw the USA as a land of opportunity, because the first thing these immigrants saw as they arrived at Ellis Island was the Statue of Liberty. America had an open-door policy for immigrants, meaning that almost anyone could enter the country. And as a result, by 1918, the USA was a multi-ethnic society. There were many factors that caused changing attitudes to immigration in the 1920s that included social fears, racism and prejudice, economic fears, fear of revolution and WB1. This essay will argue that racism was the most important reason for changing attitudes. 1. Racism and prejudice. The Ku Klux Klan reformed due to high immigration levels, and by 1924 they openly marched in Washington, D.C. with over 40,000 members to show public anger at high levels of immigration from undesirables. The widely read articles of Kenneth Roberts, a journalist in the Saturday Evening Post, argued for immigration laws to admit fewer Polish Jewish immigrants who were human parasites. By 1913, there were 1.25 million Jewish immigrants in New York who faced increased hostility. For example, Henry Ford bought a local newspaper to spread anti-Semitic propaganda. This changed attitudes as academics and politicians with little knowledge of science were accepted as experts on race. They claimed to have scientific evidence that the many new immigrants were racially inferior. Therefore, it helped to confirm to people that immigrants should not be allowed into the USA. However, this was limited in changing attitudes, as by 1929, the Ku Klux Klan's membership had dropped to fewer than 1 million, and by the 1930s, it had fallen to under 30,000. As time passed, immigrants from various backgrounds began to integrate more successfully into society and adopting American customs. This peaceful assimilation reduced the sense of threat that nativist groups like the KKK had used to fuel fear and hatred. 2. Social fears. Many Americans despised the lifestyle of immigrant groups, especially the Germans and Irish, whose cultural traditions involved what seemed to be the large consumption of alcohol, especially on the Sabbath. Alcohol was banned in 1919 with the Volstead Act. But this only led to the turf wars between immigrant crime gangs who wanted to control the supply of illegal alcohol. This changed attitudes because the soaring crime rates in neighborhoods with high concentrations of immigrants were used to stereotype connections between crime and organized immigrant gangs. This was used by politicians to demand restrictions of immigration to the USA. However, this had less of an impact on changing attitudes, as pubs and gambling houses were typically found in poor ghettos, and crime was seen as a result of poverty, not immigration. So many did not blame immigrants directly for illegal activities. Yet, the myth that immigrants were responsible for crime persisted, suggesting racism and preconceived prejudices. 3. Fear of revolution. In 1919, there was a wave of strikes in the USA. The police of Boston went on strike with 100,000 steel workers and were known as the Agents of Lenin, as many workers were recent immigrants. A series of bomb explosions in 1919 led to a campaign against communist immigrants. On New Year's Day, 1920, over 6,000 immigrants were arrested and put in prison, and 600 were deported without trial, known as the Palmer Raids. This changed attitudes as many Americans were afraid of immigrants and communists. Because of this fear, people did not question whether it was fair or legal when 6,000 immigrants were arrested. They believed protecting the country was more important. This made people even more worried and suspicious of immigrants, especially since they were told that the USA was in danger of revolution. However, this did not change attitudes, as Mitchell Palmer, America's Attorney General, warned that immigrants and communists would start a revolution on May Day. He organized police, but nothing happened, so many people felt this was too extreme and were upset about the large cost to taxpayers. As a result, it became clear that immigrants were not as dangerous as they had been made to seem. 4. Economic fears. The production line method broke down production jobs into small automated processes, with workers doing smaller jobs alongside a conveyor belt. This process meant skilled workers could easily be replaced by unskilled immigrant workers. Italian, Polish and Russian immigrants were known as blackleg labor because they were prepared to work longer hours for lower wages than their American fellow workers. This changed attitudes as immigrants were desperate for money. Many were employed as strikebreakers to replace native strikers. Therefore, financial difficulties and unemployment were often blamed on immigration, and many Americans felt that they should be prioritized in the job market over immigrants. However, this did not change attitudes, as factory and business owners valued the availability of cheap, unskilled labor from immigrants. Many of these jobs were so dangerous, dirty, or poorly paid that most Americans did not want them. Because of this, many citizens did not see immigrants as stealing their traditional jobs. Overall, wealthy white Anglo-Saxon Protestant employers often fueled anti-immigrant racism to justify paying low wages. So it was racism that caused a change in attitudes. 5. Isolationism. The 1917 Immigration Act set up a literacy test that required immigrants to pass a basic reading test. Many immigrants had received no education, failed the tests, and were refused entry. The Alien Land Law of 1913 forbade aliens from owning any agricultural land in California. It was meant to apply to all recent immigrants, but was more directed at the Japanese. This changed attitudes as in March 1920, the US Senate voted against joining the League of Nations, with President Woodrow Wilson's warning that the US should stay out of Europe's civil wars. By refusing to join the League, the US was signaling its desire to stop immigrants from bringing European conflicts into America and ended the previous open-door policy. However, this did not change attitudes, as immigration restrictions did not apply to Mexicans because cheap labor was needed during fruit harvest seasons. This shows that at least one group of immigrants was welcomed into the US, but mainly for low-paid work. Later, in the late 1920s, the Great Depression slowed immigration to low levels. Therefore, it was not isolationism that reduced immigration, but global economic problems.